Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another week of looking through the book of Esther. We're on week number 4, and we're going to be looking at chapter 3, which is where a lot of the plot starts to happen. You can see in the background there I have Dr. Evil and all of the villains laughing as their plans are starting to come together. Of course, we know the good guys win the day at the end, but right now the bad guys are in a pretty good place at the end of this chapter. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you for everybody who's been praying for me with this concussion. Sunday was not a very fun day. I'm still having headaches and that, and I'm managing. I'm able to keep doing my work, which is nice. I can work without getting migraines, which is what I was really worried about. I don't want to fall behind. But let's take a look at Esther, and let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, please open this text to our hearts. We know that you inspired the people in the New Testament to write that all Scripture is fit for teaching. All Scripture is good and that we should absorb it all, even if it's difficult to look at, Lord. Lord, we know that this passage is one of the more difficult passages in Esther. Please give us the strength to go through it and help us to learn something as we go through it as well, Lord. Even though you're not in it explicitly, it's still important that we know that you're there in the text. And if anything, Lord, this is one of the most important weeks for us to realize where you are. As sometimes for us, well, I'll get to that later. It's this portion of the book can be really relevant to us in our most tender parts of our life. And Lord, we know that you are with us every step of the way. We'd ask that you please give us open hearts for this reading. Give us answers for questions, and help me have answers for questions that people ask me. And Lord, I'd ask that you please help me to bring your word to your people. This we pray in your holy name. Amen. So let's take a look through Esther chapter 3. I'll begin by reading the chapter, the same thing I did last week. And of course, chapter 3 here opens with Haman plotting against the Jews. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all of the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all of the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces in your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all the other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, so that they may put it in the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with it as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all of the province, and to the officials of all the people, to every province in his own script, and every people in his own language. It was written in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all of the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all of the people to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the capital. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into a confusion. So let's start by having a quick timeline of the book of Esther. So far, we've looked at chapters 1 and 2, and we know that there's a 4-year gap between them. And we know King Xerxes goes and does the movie 300 over that gap, and he's back now. So what's the gap between chapters 2 and 3? Well, actually, there's another 5-year gap. So by the time that this law is written and the decree is passed to kill all of the Jews on this certain day, Esther has already been queen for 5 years, which means that she must have found favor in the eyes of King Xerxes, as unlike Vashti, she doesn't get kicked out after a little while. Let's take a quick look at the new character that it introduces, that is Haman. And now the picture I have over on the right here, Haman would be the guy leading the horse. This picture is of a point later in the story. But I like it when we're looking at the characters to have some of the art. I'm a big sucker for art that the church has created. So I like to incorporate it a little bit in the slides here. So Haman was made the Grand Vizier by Xerxes. Basically, he was the second in command. He was above all of the other officials, but he was below the king himself. This meant that all would have to bow to him, as he was essentially an extension of the king. Where he would have been the king in the king's absence. So when the people went out to the gate to bow down to Haman, they were pledging their allegiance to the king, really. And because last week we looked at the fact that Mordecai was probably an eunuch gatekeeper, when they were bowing down at the gates, it would be kind of weird that the gatekeeper wasn't bowing down too. And we'll kind of get into the reason why Mordecai and Haman have a little bit of trouble here in a few minutes. So Mordecai does not bow down to Haman, who is an Agite. And there's a specific reason for this. The Agites came from the Amalekites. Now, those of you who are really good with your Old Testament know that the Amalekites originated from Esau. Everybody remembers the story of Jacob and Esau, where Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. Well, Esau's family, as it went down generation by generation, became the Amalekites, who of course then became the Agites. So if we look at I should have grabbed my Bible a few minutes ago. Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 to 19. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail for those who were lagging behind you. And he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all of your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you will blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You will not forget. So Amalek was the first person, or the first king, that the Jews fought, or the Israelites fought after leaving Egypt. After leaving Egypt, of course, there was a little bit of a period of peace where they were wandering through the wilderness. But Amalek was the first king that said, hey, I don't like you very much, and he decided to attack them. Now in Deuteronomy here, it's saying that Alamech wasn't really a good warrior either. He wouldn't go in and attack the main force. He would go after all of the children and the elderly people who were tired and lagging behind the big column of everybody. He'd wipe them out. And then, the next set of people, he'd wipe them out. It was a very cruel way of waging war. So Haman is a very distant descendant of King Alamech, who of course was a bitter rival of the Jews, which also started all the way back with Jacob and Esau. Jacob, of course, becomes Israel. And so this rivalry between the Israelites and the Amalekites goes all the way back to these two brothers. And this is why Mordecai, will not bow down to Haman, because he is part of this horrible rivalry between these two kingdoms. To bow down to him would be like an American bowing down to a German during World War II. It doesn't happen. That's not right. So let's look at what Haman does in the story. There's a couple little interesting things that he does. And I've got a good Calvin and Hobbes comic up here where Calvin says, "I've got an idea, Dad. Maybe I'll get better grades if you offered me $1 for every D, $5 for every C, $10 for every B, and $50 for every A." Calvin's dad says, "I'm not going to bribe you, Calvin. You should apply yourself for your own good." Calvin says, "Rats, I thought I could have made an easy $4. Sometimes I feel that way in school here myself. But we see that Haman is trying to bribe the king to get this law passed, which means that it must have meant a lot to Haman, because he's the second in command. He's the person who's closest to the king. If he has something he wants, why would he have to bribe the king? And then if we read a couple verses prior to that, they're casting lots over and over again, which could be seen either, one, as them trying to settle on a date for which the Jews should be all annihilated from when writing the law, or it can be seen that Haman was just frankly terrified, which I think makes a little bit more sense from the fact that he also brings a bribe. He brings a bribe of 10,000 talents. A talent is roughly equal to 1 day's wages. So today, whatever you would make in a day in an 8-hour shift, that would be roughly 1 talent. 10,000 talents back then would be roughly equivalent to a small bribe of $18 million, which of course the king then says he doesn't accept the bribe, but enacts the law anyway. He's saying to Haman, "You're my right-hand man. I'm not going to take your money. I'm the king. I don't need your money." And then he says, "Go do with these people and your money what you will." He says, "You're my second in command. I trust you. You don't need to do all of this stuff." Which makes you question why Haman was so nervous about this. But, politics are tricky things. So we're going to take a look at something that's pretty interesting here. Some of you may have been reading through this with me and say, "Hey, what's this that my Bible says about the Greek form of Esther? Why is there extra chapters in this one, as opposed to my other Bibles, which only have, I think it's 11 chapters total? Why are there 14 or 15 chapters? This doesn't make any sense." So one of the things I wanted to talk about here is the concept of Apocrypha, which you've probably heard of before. Most people have heard of the Apocrypha. Some people, it's kind of a scandalous thing. Some people think it's an evil thing. And these are all not true. The Apocrypha is quite interesting, actually, from a study point of view. So when speaking about the Apocrypha, we're typically speaking about something called deuterocanonical books. I'm not even going to try again. It means second canon, books from the Old Testament. And these are books that primarily the Jewish people would have a lot of experience with. And it's kind of tossed up between, throughout history, it's been questioned whether or not that they should be in the Bible. And we're going to get to some of the reasons why here in a few minutes. There's more than a couple books, too, and you've probably heard of some of them. So, for example, we have Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, like what we're looking at right now, the Book of Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, additions to Daniel, the Song of the Three Children, the Story of Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, which is the artwork that I have here is about Bel and the Dragon, and 1 to 4 Maccabees. And there's a bunch of reasons why these weren't incorporated in our Bible, and we have Martin Luther to thank for that one, actually. But we're going to take a look at some about what the Apocrypha really is. So the Apocryphal books were taken out during the Reformation. Some denominations still have them, and there's nothing wrong with that. So if you're reading the book of Esther through a Catholic Bible, you're going to notice some of the extra chapters, and you're going to notice some books that usually you wouldn't see in some of the other, like a King James Bible or a standard Bible like what we would use. And there's a couple reasons for this. And Martin Luther and the Reformation were the deciding factor in why these were removed. So the first out of the two reasons why they weren't incorporated into our Bibles is that the original Hebrew for these texts could no longer be found. The only thing that was left was the Greek translations. So before Jesus came about, everything was only written in Hebrew. But when the Romans and stuff like that started to come down, and the Greek culture started to influence a large swath of the area, a lot of people started speaking Greek. And a lot of people lived outside of Jerusalem, or a lot of Jews lived outside of Israel, and they spoke Greek, not Hebrew, because they never lived in Jerusalem. But they still wanted to practice Judaism. So one of the things that they did was they made something, and you've probably heard of it, called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is just a Greek translation of all of the Hebrew books, the books that we would have in our Old Testament. And when they translated them over history, the Greek translations were what stayed the most. Some of the Hebrew stuff kind of fell out of disfavor because more people were speaking Greek than what were speaking Hebrew. And in this, we have a lot of Greek translations and Greek manuscripts of a lot of Old Testament stuff, but we don't have a lot of the original Hebrew because it's so much older than a lot of the Greek translations. So when Martin Luther came along and said, I'm not really sure if these books should be in the Old Testament anymore, one of the reasons was they only have those newer Greek translations. And by newer, I mean, not that long before Jesus came around. So it wasn't really new, but it was a lot newer than the Hebrew translations. And then reason number 2 why they weren't added was the Jews of the late 1st century onward didn't even consider them canonical. So the Jews who only have the books of the Old Testament, they didn't consider them canon. And we also have to question, what do we mean when we say canon? Now, there's a pretty important quote here from Martin Luther himself. He says that Apocrypha, that are books that are not considered equal to the whole Apocrypha, that are books which are not considered equal to the Holy Scriptures, but they're still useful and good to read. One of the things that we're going to talk about with the Esther editions that the translator put in is that there's nothing wrong with them. They add some little details here and there, but they don't really change anything. There's no meat or substance or theological questions that they're pushing forward. It's just some extra detail, extra fluff. It's not helping us get to know who God is better, which is the point of the Bible. So let's take a look at Esther's Apocrypha specifically. What does the Greek translation add to the Bible of Esther that we don't have in our Bible specifically? So when the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into the Greek, like I said, known as the Septuagint, The translation added a few things to this chapter, or added a few things to the book. In chapter 3, it added a copy of the letter that Haman wrote. So the law that we were talking about that Haman bribed the king to send out, there's a copy of that the Septuagint adds, or that the Apocrypha adds. It also adds a dream that Mordecai had. The plot against the king that Mordecai thwarted in chapter 2 has a little bit more detail to it. It also includes Esther and Mordecai praying, and Esther meeting the king again after they've been married. A copy of the decree that Xerxes sends out in chapter 8, which we'll get to later, and a short part at the end detailing how Mordecai's dream at the beginning was fulfilled. And it's pretty important that we realize that at the end of the day, do these really add anything? I mean, some of them are interesting, don't get me wrong, but they might add some detail, but no substance. They might add more world building, and this is, if you don't know what world building means, the first week that we looked at Esther, we just looked at the history around the book. That's the world building of Esther. It's talking about the history and all the important stuff around it, like how we understand the book. And it might add a little bit more of that, but not really anything that we don't already know. And this is something that the Apocrypha tends to do a lot. And this is the reason why Martin Luther decided not to have it. Sorry, Martin Luther and the Reformers decided not to include it in our Bible. It wasn't because Martin Luther had a thing against the Book of Tobit or any of the rest of the Apocrypha. It was because, and like the quote here saying that the Apocrypha, that are books which are not considered equal to the Holy Scriptures, but are still useful and good to read. He's saying that they're still useful and that they're still good to read, but they aren't equal to the Holy Scriptures. They aren't. So for a really good example of this is books 1 through 4 of Maccabees bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which is an issue that some people have sometimes when they're reading through the Bible. They'll say, wow, we went from these minor prophets to the New Testament. What happened in between? Well, books 1 through 4 of Maccabees detail that history in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And some people will say, well, why isn't that just in the Bible again? Or why isn't that just in the Bible? That sounds pretty important. But we have to realize that the Bible isn't about history. It's about knowing God. Books 1 through 4 of Maccabees are fascinating reads because it details the history between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it doesn't tell us anything about God. It doesn't tell us anything important about God's character or about how he deals with us as humans. It's rather just history. And the other books that they were taken out follow along much the same lines. They don't tell us anything new about God that the rest of the books already tell us. And the Bible is already a pretty big book, so they wanted to make it readable for the common man. The Apocrypha sometimes gets a pretty bad rep. And especially with us as Baptists and Protestants, where our roots, Martin Luther and the Reformation, have taken out those things in the Bible, our first reaction to say is, oh, well, they were taken out of the Bible, so that must mean that they were evil or something, or that we should never ever look at them. Well, that's not necessarily true. Like I said with Maccabees, it's important that we have these, because like I said, it details the history of this gap that we don't have anything in the Bible for. But it doesn't add anything. It just adds some context. It doesn't add anything about God. Like I said, the Bible isn't a history book. It's a book about God and how he reveals himself to us and how he deals with us as humans. So let's take a quick look. Where is God in this passage? Let's move away from the Apocrypha and go back to the story of this passage, because I incorporated the picture of all the villains up there laughing for a reason. And I like this picture of the little girl saying, please don't let the bad guys win. Because if the book of Esther ended on this point, it would seem like the bad guys won. I mean, the law was passed that the Jews were going to be executed on this day. And, you know, it wasn't just a couple of Jews. This was every Jew in Persia, the largest empire on earth at the time. This was a genocide that was decreed by law. This seems like the bad guys are going to win. There's confusion, anger, plotting of genocide, and racism here. Well, technically anti-Semitism. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in this passage. On the flip side, though, we also have a lot of good stuff. For example, bravery with the side of Mordecai. I think I spelled Mordecai's name there wrong. But if we look at him refusing to bow to Haman, we see a sign of bravery. We see Mordecai refusing to obey the second in command of the empire. And of course, as we learn later on in the book, if you approach the king without an invitation, the king can just execute you on the spot for daring to do that. But here's Mordecai, who's openly casting offense at the second in command. You know, Mordecai is really putting his neck out here. I suppose there's a little bit of irony in that statement as we look later on in the book. But Mordecai is really putting himself in a position of danger here. Mordecai is being brave. He's doing the right thing. So often when times are the bleakest, it's the hardest to see God. But we also have to realize it's the most important time to realize that he is right there with us. I know it's kind of cheesy, but when I was reading through this passage and I was reading about Mordecai's bravery, and last week when we were looking at Esther and how brave that she was, one of the things I was reminded of was the poem of the footprints. And I know everybody knows that poem. I can't remember who wrote it, but it basically says that you're walking down the beach with God, and the guy looks back down the beach at all the hardest points in his life, and he realizes that there's only one set of footprints. And then he asks God, well, why weren't you there with me? Why weren't you helping me? I only see one set of footprints. And then God, of course, comes back and says, there's one set of footprints because I was carrying you through that. I know it's kind of cheesy. It's a little overdone. But there's a really good message there. As we're getting into this book, we're starting to get into the meat of the plot. We're starting to see some people in some pretty bleak and dark times. A lot of confusion. As we look, the entire capital of Susa, after this law was passed, was entirely confused because they were just handed this law that says, slaughter every Jew in the town. It'd be like if we just got a law from one of our politicians that says, on the 5th of November, you have to kill every person with green eyes. They're evil. We can't have them. It's a lot. And a lot of people were very confused. And it was a very dark time for a lot of people. But we have to and one of the hardest parts with this, no matter where you are in life, we've all been through hard things. We've all had difficult areas in our lives. And oftentimes it's when we're in the middle of those that it's the hardest to see God. When we're in the middle of those difficult points, you feel alone. But like in the poem of the footprints, we realize that those are the times that God is carrying us through. It's in those dark nights of the soul that we realize that Jesus is the only one who's there with us. We may feel alone, but we are never alone. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's hard. Especially when we're doing wrong. Because we know that Christ is there with us all the time. I'm reminded a little bit of the Looney Tunes here for a little bit of humor. It's like when you're watching the Roadrunner and stuff like that. The coyote's got his trap all set up, and he's sitting there sipping tea or whatever, just waiting for the Roadrunner to get into his trap, only for the Roadrunner to never get in the trap, and it's all foiled anyway. Or, the bad guy thinks he has his plan all set up, it's all going to work, nothing can stop him, And then the good guy comes out of nowhere and thwarts the whole plan. When we get to the end of chapter 3 here, that's what it feels like. It feels like the bad guys, the king and Haman, are both sitting there. Well, it says they're literally there drinking wine, looking at the capital, ready, because Haman's plan is set. They're going to kill all of the Jews. Like I said, if we cut the book of Esther off here and said this is where it ends, that'd be a pretty depressing ending, because we just assume that all of the Jews in Persia were killed. Of course, we know that this isn't the case, but I'm reminded of the Looney Tunes a little bit here, because in the next couple chapters, we just wait for God to swoop in and save the day. So just as a final thing here, I didn't have any questions this week. I have a little teary face there. I always enjoy answering questions, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm very much looking forward to getting back in person with these. Discussions make Bible studies quite a bit easier and quite a bit better, really. When it's just me talking to my cat back here in my apartment by myself, sometimes it's a little harder to chase down those rabbit trails that tend to crop up so much into Bible study. Remember when I was quite young, I would attend Dad's Bible studies, and I'd love to hear all of the different rabbit trails that they'd chase down all the time. As we look through this, as we go through the Bible together, and we're looking at these different areas of theology, and theology is just the study of God. It's not this pie in the sky, ivory tower academic stuff. As we look through all of this together, it's important that we do it together and not by ourselves. Sometimes what might seem like a stupid question is the most important question you could ever ask. Sometimes the simplest question comes up with the most complex answer too. I know my dad said that the best pastors give long answers to short questions. And I can guarantee you that some of you have noticed that some of the short questions that you've been giving me turned into quite long answers. But that's because they're important, especially when we're talking about God, what it means to be a Christian, and how he works with us. It's important that we know as much as we can. It's important that we take the time to have those long answers to those short questions, because when we're at our darkest days, when we need God the most, we know that he's there with us. And it's important that we have that ongoing relationship with him. I also wanted to mention just quickly before we close down that even when we're in person, the Bible studies are still going to be recorded and posted online. I'll just have it filming us while we're talking. I'm doing that because I don't want anybody to be left behind. Right now, the current regulation is that if you come to a Bible study or anything that isn't just a church service, you need to have your Vax pass. But I want to make sure that nobody's left behind. It's really important that we incorporate everybody into fellowship, regardless of what they choose to do in life. I'm not going to judge anybody for what they choose. But I want to be able to make sure that everybody can get to it if at all possible. And for another reason, we get a lot of people watching these things too, especially with the church services and stuff like that. We're getting more people watching the videos every week than we would be with people just having bums and pews. So at the very least, we're reaching quite a wide audience here with this online stuff. It's a bit of a hassle sometimes, but we have to realize that if we're true Christians, we want to approach as many people as possible with this good news. And if online is one of those things that can help us do it, then that's one of the things that can help us do it. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.